The loud buzz of my phone against the granite countertop shattered the peace of my morning coffee. It was a text from my daughter-in-law, Sloane. I opened it casually, hoping for a cute picture of my 4-year-old grandson, Miles. But the words on the screen made my blood run cold. Nadine, we're throwing my mom's birthday party at your place this Saturday. We'll have about 25 people. Make sure the fridge is fully stocked by Friday afternoon. I read the text twice. There was no question mark. It wasn't a polite request or a quick check to see if I had plans. It was plain and simple. An order. My name is Nadine Caldwell. I'm 67 years old, and since my husband passed away 4 years ago, I've lived alone in this 4-bedroom house. It's my refuge, my sanctuary. My son, Julian, and Sloane don't live with me, but they had a spare key for emergencies. A key that, over time, Sloane had turned into her personal VIP pass, treating my home like a free event venue. I set my ceramic mug down on the table, dried my hands on a dish towel, and typed a single word, no. Less than a minute later, the screen lit up again. Sloane had replied, tacking on a crying, laughing emoji. We're coming anyway. Have the backyard cleaned up for the tables. I turned off the screen. I didn't feel a sudden burst of blind rage, nor did I break down crying over the sheer disrespect. I was just bone-tired of her endless entitlement. Julian was a good man, but his passivity had turned him into a doormat for his wife's whims. He avoided conflict in his marriage at the direct expense of my peace of mind. I settled back into my chair and looked out at the garden my late husband had loved so much. If Sloane thought I was going to be her doormat for one more minute, she had another thing coming. Friday morning was going to require a plan, and I knew exactly where to start. When Friday morning rolled around, I didn't start the car to go to the grocery store for cheese platters and drinks for 25 people. Instead, I grabbed my purse and drove straight to the biggest hardware store in town. I walked the aisles, breathing in the smell of metal, freshly cut lumber, and paint. That scent always gave me a strange sense of clarity. I stopped at the hardware section and meticulously picked out 2 heavy-duty, solid brass deadbolts for the front and back doors. The clerk offered to schedule an installation for the following week, but I politely declined, paid in cash, and headed home. My husband had taught me how to change a lock decades ago when we were fixing up our starter home. It wasn't rocket science. By noon, my hands were covered in a fine metallic dust, but the old locks, the ones Julian and Sloane had the keys to, were sitting at the bottom of the trash can. I tested the new deadbolts. The heavy, metallic click sounded firm and final. My house was a fortress, once again. However, I knew a locked door wouldn't stop the inevitable circus on my front lawn. So, I picked up the phone and called a small, local, private security firm. I paid up front for a weekend patrol detail at the entrance of my property. I made it crystal clear to the supervisor, no one has permission to enter this property from 3 p.m. today until Sunday night. I don't care if they show up with sheet cakes and balloons, or if they scream that they're family. The property is on lockdown. The supervisor agreed, guaranteeing a guard in a high-vis vest would block driveway access. With the perimeter secured, I headed upstairs to my bedroom. Now I just needed to pack my own bags, because there was no way in hell I was sticking around to watch the freak show. I packed a weekend duffel bag with some comfortable clothes, a couple of light sweaters, my favorite mystery novel, and a tin of loose-leaf tea. I didn't leave a dramatic note on the kitchen island. They didn't deserve a handwritten explanation for a party I had explicitly refused to host. I turned the key in the new front door lock checked the heavy brass handle, and pulled my car out of the garage right on schedule. I had booked a room at a rustic little boutique hotel a couple of towns over, tucked away among tall pines and hiking trails. At exactly 4 p.m., while I was unpacking my suitcase in my wood-paneled room, my phone started buzzing. It was Julian. I let it go straight to voicemail. 5 minutes later, the screen flashed with Sloane's name. I silenced the ringer completely, turned off my notifications, and placed the phone face down on the nightstand. I brewed a hot cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the leaves rustle in the afternoon breeze. In my mind's eye, I could perfectly picture the chaotic scene unfolding miles away. I pictured the 25 guests pulling up in their cars, holding wrapped gifts and casseroles, only to find my driveway blocked, the curtains drawn, and a burly security guard with crossed arms politely but firmly turning them away. I imagined Sloane's absolute meltdown, probably tearing up the front porch looking for a spare key under the mat, only to realize the entire lock had been swapped out. At 6 p.m., I lit up the screen for a second. I had 8 missed calls from Julian and 17 from Sloane, followed by a tidal wave of texts pivoting from pure confusion to outright hostility. Unlock the door right now. My family is standing in the street. With total calm, I went into my settings and temporarily blocked both of their numbers. I felt a tiny pang of guilt for my son, but I squashed it immediately. He was 35 years old. It was high time he learned how to handle his own wife's unreasonable demands. I cracked open my book. My weekend, finally, was entirely mine. I pulled into my driveway late Sunday afternoon. Everything was exactly as I had left it, peaceful, spotless, and dead quiet. There was no party debris littering my lawn, no trampled flower beds, and no mountain of dirty dishes in my kitchen. The new locks and the security guard had done their jobs flawlessly. I unpacked my bag and started throwing together a simple dinner of roasted vegetables and chicken breast. Just as I was pulling the hot sheet pan out of the oven, I heard a car engine cut off outside. I peeked out the kitchen window. Julian's SUV was parked in the driveway. He shuffled up to the front porch, totally alone. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and opened the door. He looked utterly exhausted. His shoulders slumped and his eyes defeated. "Mom!" He sighed heavily. I leaned against the doorframe, making no move to let him in. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was? Sloane's family had to cram into the back of a fast food restaurant to celebrate her mother." I looked right at him, keeping my voice low and totally even. I told her no. Julian. She chose not to listen. "You changed the locks," he protested, rubbing his temples in frustration. "You could have just talked to us." "I did," I replied firmly. "I said no. My house is not a free public event hall for your wife's family." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly squirming. "Sloane is furious. She says you humiliated her on purpose. She expects an apology immediately." An icy, serene calm settled in my chest. I wasn't even mad, just profoundly disappointed at how small my son made himself when it came to her. I turned back toward the hallway. "Wait here." I walked to the hall closet and pulled out a heavy cardboard box full of his old college textbooks and trophies junk that had been taking up space for a decade. I lugged it over and dropped it by his shoes. "Take this home. And Julian, tell your wife I won't be apologizing for securing my own property." I shut the door gently in his face and slid the deadbolt home, letting the silence do the talking. For the next 2 weeks, the silence from my son and daughter-in-law was deafening. I knew Sloane's playbook inside and out, the silent treatment. They had a 4-year-old son, my only grandchild, Miles, In the past, if I ever crossed Sloane even slightly, she would suddenly become too busy to let me see him. She expected me to crack to call her begging, offering expensive gifts or free babysitting just to win back her favor. I missed my grandson with all my heart, but this time, I absolutely refused to play her game. Instead of sitting anxiously by the phone, I walked down the hall to the guest room. 3 years ago, Sloane had demanded I convert that space into a permanent bedroom for Miles. She picked out the paint, the crib that transitioned into a toddler bed, the bookshelves, and the toys. I naturally footed the bill. Sloane used it as an excuse to dump him there whenever she wanted a weekend free of responsibilities. I hauled out a stack of cardboard moving boxes. Methodically, I broke down the toddler bed, boxed up the toys, and folded the little blankets. I didn't throw anything away. I just stacked the boxes neatly in a dry, safe corner of my garage. The next day, I hired a local painter to cover over the pastel yellow walls with a rich, soothing sage green. Once the paint dried, I moved in my sewing machine, my painting canvases, a plush reading chair, and the wooden drafting table I hadn't touched since I retired. By the end of the week, the room was no longer a monument to my daughter-in-law's convenience. It was my personal studio, a space entirely dedicated to my interests. The physical labor of clearing it out had been deeply therapeutic. Every taped-up box felt like a piece of my independence coming back to me, bracing me for the inevitable showdown. I was sipping chamomile tea in my new reading chair when a sharp knock echoed from the front door. I checked the peephole. It was Julian. I turned the heavy deadbolt and let him in. He had dark circles under his eyes, and his face looked pale. He walked into the hallway, and his eyes immediately darted to the open door of what used to be Miles's room. He stopped dead in his tracks, eyes wide. "Where is all of Miles's stuff?" he asked, completely bewildered. "Stored safely in the garage," I said matter-of-factly. "Miles is 4 now. He doesn't need a permanent bedroom here. I needed the space for my hobbies." He swallowed hard, clearly unsure how to argue with such foolproof logic. He followed me into the kitchen and slumped onto a bar stool. "Mom, we're in a really tight spot," he started, staring down at his hands. "The transmission on Sloane's car blew out. It's gonna cost almost $3,000 to fix. Our credit cards are maxed out from, well, recent expenses. We were hoping you could spot us a loan." In the past, my pen would have already been hovering over my checkbook. I had always been their unconditional safety net. I walked over to the kitchen drawer and pulled out my little household ledger. I didn't open it to show him my balance, but rather to a page I had dog-eared earlier. "Julian, I paid off your student loans 3 years ago. I gave you 2 the down payment for your house. I have supported you enough." I closed the ledger with a soft but final thud. "I have savings, yes, but I'm on a fixed income now, and I refuse to keep acting as your emergency fund. I am not paying for Sloane's car." "But Mom, how is she supposed to get to work?" he pleaded, panic rising in his voice. "She'll have to figure it out." I looked him dead in the eye, unblinking. "She can take the bus, or you can drive her, but my bank is officially closed." His shoulders dropped like someone had strapped a lead weight to them. He realized there was zero room for negotiation and walked out the door in total silence. Now. It was only a matter of time before Sloane tried to force things her way. A week later, I was in the foyer buttoning up my wool coat. I had joined a local book club that met on Thursday mornings, and I was looking forward to discussing the latest novel over a good cup of coffee. Just as I grabbed my leather purse, a car came flying into my driveway. I watched through the window as Sloane slammed on the brakes. She marched up the concrete walkway, dragging little Miles by the hand. She didn't ring the bell. She grabbed the doorknob and yanked hard, expecting it to give way like it always had in the past. Finding it locked, she pounded her fist against the wood. I opened the door. Sloane tried to shoulder past me into the house, dropping Miles's little backpack on the porch floor. I have a salon appointment I absolutely refuse to cancel, and Julian is working, she announced, not even bothering to make eye contact. I need you to watch Miles until 3. Make sure he eats his vegetables. She pivoted to march back to her car. Sloane, stop, I ordered. My voice wasn't a yell, but it had enough steel in it to freeze her in her tracks. She spun around, looking incredibly annoyed. I looked down at my grandson and gave him a warm, reassuring smile before turning my attention back to her. I have plans this morning. I'm leaving in 5 minutes. Cancel your appointment. She let out a scoff of disbelief, throwing a hand in the air. This is your grandson, Nadine. Family comes first. I adjusted my purse strap on my shoulder. I love Miles with all my heart. But I am not your on-call babysitter. You didn't ask if I could help. You demanded it. The answer is no. I stepped out onto the porch, pulled the door shut behind me, and locked it, slipping the key into my pocket. Take him with you. Sloane. Her jaw practically hit the floor. She stood there, completely dumbfounded, staring at the locked door and then at me. Are you serious? You're just gonna leave us stranded, she spat, all her arrogance vanishing. Yes, I replied, my expression completely flat. I walked over to my car and drove off, leaving her alone to deal with her own reality. Over the next month, the reality of my new boundaries started taking a very visible toll on Julian and Sloane's lives. Without my silent, ongoing cash injections, their lifestyle hit a brick wall. I heard through a family friend that they'd had to abruptly cancel a luxury vacation to the Cape. Julian had started picking up extra weekend shifts at his firm just to cover basic bills and the mechanic's invoice. I didn't take pleasure in their struggles, but I wasn't going to step in, either. I spent my days doing exactly what I wanted. I worked in my garden, planting new hydrangeas, and read in my sage green room without anyone bursting in to interrupt me. That low-level, constant anxiety I used to feel wondering when Sloane's next demanding text would drop was completely gone. One Tuesday afternoon, I was in the produce section of the grocery store when I spotted Sloane. She was meticulously comparing the prices of organic strawberries. She held a plastic clamshell, checked the price tag, and then, with a heavy sigh of resignation, put it back on the shelf and grabbed the conventional ones. She looked exhausted. Her usually blowout-perfect hair was thrown up in a messy plastic claw clip. She didn't see me. I didn't go out of my way to say hello or offer to pay for her groceries. I simply steered my cart down the next aisle, pushing it quietly. In that moment, it hit me that my actions hadn't just protected my own peace of mind, they had forced them to live within their actual means. By removing myself as their bottomless safety net and unpaid labor force, I had pushed them into the real world. The tension between us still hung in the air, but I knew their pride couldn't hold out forever. Something had to give, and for the first time in years, I knew it wasn't going to be me. I drove home feeling a deep, quiet lightness, just waiting for the day someone finally knocked on my door with a different attitude. It was a rainy Sunday when the doorbell finally rang. I peeked through the window and saw Julian standing on the wet porch, alone, holding a small pastry box from my favorite bakery. I slid the heavy deadbolt back and let him in. He wiped his shoes on the mat and walked over to the kitchen island. I brought those lemon scones you like, he offered, his voice hesitant. I brewed 2 cups of tea in silence. Finally, Julian let out a long sigh. I'm sorry, Mom, for everything. For the disaster with the party, for expecting you to pay for the car, and for Sloane's attitude, he said, staring at the bottom of his mug. I was so afraid of arguing with her at home that I let her disrespect you in yours. I was a coward. I didn't rush in to tell him everything was forgotten. I let his honest words hang in the air. I appreciate you saying that. Julian, I finally replied. I love you and Miles, but I am never going to be treated like an ATM or an on-call nanny ever again. I know. He nodded quickly. We've had a rough month. We had to take a hard look at our finances, and it's been a major reality check. We want you in our lives, but we understand things have to change. He had taken the first step, but I knew the real test would be when Sloane walked through that same door under my rules. 6 months flew by. Julian and Sloane were now visiting every couple of weeks, always calling days in advance. The demanding texts had stopped entirely. Sloane found a daycare program for Miles, finally understanding that my front door would remain bolted against any surprise drop-offs. She still wasn't the warmest daughter-in-law, but she respected my space out of sheer necessity. She knew I would enforce my boundaries at the drop of a hat. That evening, I was hosting a small dinner party on my own terms. I had invited my son, my daughter-in-law, my grandson, and a couple of my girlfriends. As I pulled a juicy roast chicken out of the oven, the doorbell rang. I went to open it. Julian was holding a bottle of wine, and Sloane was carrying a vibrant bouquet of tulips. Thanks for having us, Mom, my son said. Sloane offered a polite smile and handed me the flowers. They're beautiful. Come on in, I replied, stepping aside. I ushered them into the living room where my friends were already chatting, and headed back to the kitchen, humming softly to myself. I looked out the window at my garden. I hadn't needed a lawyer, hysterical screaming matches, or to pack up and move to another city. I just needed to remember that I held the keys to my life, my money, and my home. I was living exactly the life I had chosen, and no one was ever going to take the wheel again.